Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I would like to welcome you to the first ever seminar in the Northwest Seminar Series of Mathematical Biology and Data Science. This new seminar series is co-organized by the universities of Liverpool, Manchester, and Liverpool John Moores University. It is really a team effort of 5 people: Carl Whitfield, Mudassar Iqbal, and Igor Chernavsky from the University of Manchester, and Mirella Domian from the University of Liverpool. In the 3 months until Christmas, we will have a great lineup of 16 speakers from the UK, from Europe, and across the world. So we will have talks sometimes once and sometimes even twice a week. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker, Ezio Venturino from the University of Torino in Italy. Ezio is a well-known expert in mathematical ecology, especially in biological invasions and ecoepidemiology, which is also the field he's going to talk about today. I would like to emphasize that together with Sergei Petrovsky and Horst Malchow, he has published the book Spatiotemporal Patterns in Ecology and Epidemiology, which is one of the books you should read if you would like to get into spatiotemporal modeling of ecosystems. But Ezio actually started out as a numerical analyst, and he got his PhD in this field in 1984 at the State University of New York at Stony Brooks. He then spent a long time, 12 years, in Iowa in the US before he returned to Europe. Please let me also say a few personal words about Ezio. I met Ezio in 2006 when I was a PhD student in Osnabrück in Germany. After my PhD advisor, he was the second scientist I seriously worked with. After my PhD, we didn't have the chance to see each other very often, so I'm very happy today that he's going to give the first talk in our seminar series. Ezio will present work with the ecologist Valentina Lamorgia on 2 different biological invasions in Italy. In the first part of his talk, he will speak about the invasion of the gray squirrel, which displaces the native red squirrel, similarly to what has already happened in many areas of the UK. In the second part of his talk, he will introduce us to the invasion of the European hare that is outcompeting the native mountain hare in the Piedmont region in Italy. I look forward to Ezio's talk on mathematical models for fighting alien species invasion in Italy. Over to you, Ezio.
And I re-emphasize the fact that this is a research joint with Valentina Lamorgia, who has contributed to both ideas in squirrels and hares invasions in Italy. I mean, from the biological point of view. I mean, squirrels are important also. I mean, the invasion of gray squirrels is important also in the UK. In Britain, I don't know how it occurred. In Italy, it's because there was a couple of American squirrels that were imported as pets in Genoa, and then they escaped, and then they started to reproduce. That occurred about 70 years ago, and ever since we have the problem. We have investigated, I mean, several issues here, and the first one is whether I mean, this came from a question or a talk that I had with my colleague Guido Badino, now retired in biologist that is now retired in the University of Torino, and he mentioned that mainly, or a possibility for invader populations to invade persistently the environment is because they have larger carrying capacity, because they, I mean, they live in an environment in which they can, that partly overlaps one native species and partly another native species that do not compete with each other, but the invader can exploit this possibility. So the idea is that I wanted to make a model to investigate this situation, and so we have here a model that contains the invader I, the native species, first native species N, and another native species, which is E for, no, sorry, I is indigenous, so native, N is another native population, and E is the invader exogenous. exotic species. And the model consists of three logistic equations, and then competition only between the exotic and the two native species, but there are no interactions whatsoever between the native species because they live in different environments. And the question is whether this model can support the idea that the different carrying capacity, probably Z is larger than both V and U, or I mean, as a set, Z intersects with both U and V. Seen, I mean, these seen as sets and not as parameters, as not numbers. And this allows the survival of the foreign invader. And the results are that there are several equilibria. Here I listed some of them, and here is, I don't know if you can see the whole table, but in any case, there are 8 possible equilibria, of which only 5 can be stable, conditionally stable. Here there are the conditions. I listed them probably in these slides, but I'm not going to deal with them. And the point is that there are no hope of bifurcation, and global stability for the coexistence equilibrium could be obtained through Elia-Puno function. The system could exhibit bistability, so there are pairs of equilibria that can coexist mutually. They can be attained by the system just by starting from different initial conditions that pertain to different attraction basins. I will say more about that later. And simultaneous stability of 3 or more of these points is forbidden. And the point is that okay, here I have several other pictures, but I show only one. This is a bistability. You have the crosses in which indigenous and native species survive, and the squirrel is, the gray squirrel, the invader, is wiped out. But then you have another situation in which both, for example, both native species disappear and the invader survives. And you can also have intermediate situations, but I do not show them. So the point is, I mean, the analysis, I mean, I don't look at all the details that I write here, but the point is that essentially the invader can survive in the new environment with mechanisms that are not really related to the larger carrying capacity. That is the main meaning of this model. And then there are some other important conclusions. Once the invasion has started, you cannot really stop it, and that is what we are seeing, at least in Italy. And eventually, to try to curb the invasion, there should be, I mean, some artificial means to be undertaken, for example, safety niches, and that prompted another line of let's say, paper, which is this one, in which we explore a similar model in which there is a parameter B that reduces, B is a fraction, it reduces the effect of the competition between the exotic species and the native one. Okay, and probably here I have no, that's okay. And then you have the equilibria, which are 4 here, with some feasibility conditions. Then the Jacobian and some stability conditions that are, some of them are listed here. There could be competitive exclusion, and mutually exclusive equilibria with only native and exotic population can coexist stably. This is a model only with 2 populations. Sorry, but the topic is getting hot. So I need to take out my nice, if you see, Tasmanian University of Tasmania bracket. Anyway, so here you have the situation, and the point is that there are two mutually exclusive equilibria on the axis, and there are two more equilibria that are the origin and this point here that are saddles that partition the space, the phase space into two domains of attraction. And this line is a separatrix, and what I'm saying is that to calculate it, we have developed, there will be some references later, we have developed advanced numerical methods for computing this. This is relatively easy in 2 dimensions, but you will see now in this model, which is 3-dimensional, that it is a bit less easy. Here there are two native species. There is the invader, and again there is competition, but then you have a reduced competition due to the niche for n, represented by the fraction b, and the niche for I, represented by the fraction e. And again, you can calculate the equilibrium. I'm not going to through all the details, but there could be here also, there is also the bistability situation with these pairs of points. And here you see one of such cases. So the point is that we have computed numerically this surface, which is a separatrix in the 3-dimensional phase space between the equilibrium with only the exotic species, so no native species, and this equilibrium, which is this red dot, which actually lies on the plane. So it is the equilibrium in which both local native species survive, but there is no invader. And this point is very close to the separatrix surface, which indicates the fact that it is very difficult to eradicate the invader. Of course, you can, I mean, you are in the phase space, so if you start from here, from this basin of attraction, the system will be drawn to this equilibrium. If you start from below the surface, you will be drawn to the other one, the invader-free equilibrium. And the point is that in both cases, the system has the same set of parameters, only the initial conditions are different. And this set of parameters identifies essentially uniquely this surface. Okay, here I didn't want to put many slides because, but these are the main references. And there are also contributions, more recent contributions by Frank Ilker and Marta Paliaga, who now completed the PhD, but she's from Palermo, but from Sicily, but she came to Torino for the master, and we met when she was a student in my class. So the point is that with these models, we can try to preserve a native population with suitable choice of parameters, but there are single populations that are mutually exclusive, so this depends on the conditions of the system in the present state, whether we can attain these points or not. For the 3-population model, which is more realistic, because I mean, in nature there are many species present in an environment. The points, I mean, as I said before, to eradicate the exotic population is rather difficult because essentially there are points in which the exotic population always appears. There are some conditions for which you can try, I mean, that you can try to satisfy in order to eliminate, to eradicate the invader. The niche enhances the stability of the coexistence, which is partly good because the native species will thrive, but still you have the invader. And you can try to get a larger native population and lower exotic population values if you try to satisfy these conditions, but the question is, how do you implement the niche? So this is a paper or an investigation in which we posed, you see, the point is that that I'm trying to make here is that the problem is really a problem that arises from the actual situation in the field. And here I'm stating a question saying, well, suppose that we have a niche available, what would happen? And then you set up the model and you find that maybe something you can do. And the point is, it is a theoretical model that maybe could suggest to the biologists that work on the field that if they find a way to implement a niche, then that could be a tool in overcoming, or at least partly overcoming the problem. So the role of models is not just to interpret what is actually in the field, but suggest also steps further. The next step is the fact that, at least in the UK, for sure now, but in Italy it could be the case in the future, the gray squirrels are vectors of the pox virus, parapox virus, which is a deadly disease, a deadly virus for the red squirrel. So to foresee future scenarios in Italy and maybe to complement the actual research in the UK, we set up this model and we wanted it to be still simple. I mean, we have here introduced high non-linearities like similar to Holling type 2 terms, or maybe Beddington De Angelis functional responses, whatever you want to call them, but fractional responses. And I think here we assume that the gray squirrel is an asymptomatic carrier. So all the Gs are infected. And then if they come in contact with the Rs, with the red squirrel that are healthy, so G times R makes a new infected at rate beta. So I is the red squirrel that gets infected. Besides, red squirrels can be in contact with other infected red squirrels at rate lambda and also get infected. And the major point is that the I dynamics does not show vital dynamics because the disease kills the native squirrels within a few days, so they cannot reproduce. And we assume that they become so, so weak that they cannot even hunt. So there is no vital dynamics other than the recruitment here and the natural plus disease-related mortality mu. I'm going fast, but I have lack of time, so I hope the concepts are clear to everyone. Otherwise, you can ask questions later. And I think this competition of the gray squirrel occurs only with the red ones because, again, the infected ones are too weak. This is the remark that I made here. So here there are the parameters with some units, and maybe at some point there will be some values probably. But we reformulated the model using the total native squirrel population N, so R plus I, and the prevalence, which is the number of infected over the total population. This because it gives us a better perspective of the equilibrium. So here there are some parameters, the ones that are known, some hypothetical, which are the mortality for the infected, and C, which is a parameter that appears in the response function, a range of values for carrying capacities and reproduction, and initial conditions, with no disease present at first among the red squirrels. So I was saying about the equilibria, the point is that you can have a little bit more information if you use this reformulation rather than using R and capital I, which are the sizes of the red and healthy red squirrels and infected red squirrels. If you use N and I, total population and prevalence, you can distinguish between these two equilibria. Here, the red squirrel population disappears, but the disease is endemic, in the sense, not only endemic, but it's, within the species is pandemic, in the sense that everybody in the population becomes eventually infected before dying. In this case, the disease is still endemic, I4 is less than 1, the total population vanishes, but there is a small fraction, 1 minus I4, of red squirrels that is still healthy before the population dies or as the population disappears. It is a slight difference between the two because in the end the outcome is the same. The native squirrels are wiped out, but it is an information. And this is the point that we would like to attain, which is the survival of the native species with no gray squirrels. It can be attained under these conditions that are probably maybe difficult to obtain in reality. The analysis shows that there is a hope bifurcation for this equilibrium, but not for the other ones. And okay, here there are the comments, but I skip them. In the simulations, you can see, for example, that if you, in the left, the red squirrels, which are the dotted red lines, are wiped out on the left. On the right, it's the same thing. The zero level is here. Here, the zero level is here, so they are wiped out again also on the right, but the speed at which they die out is faster here and smaller here. And this is due to the fact that on the right, we take a lower value for the natural plus disease-related mortality. So the difference in mu changes the speed at which the species is eradicated, unfortunately, because it's the species of interest. But this is an information that is useful because, I mean, biologists would know that maybe if mu is smaller or if they can decrease mu, then they would gain time in fighting the invaders. This is another situation in which instead here the squirrels disappear on a longer time span, but again with differences in mu 2,000 and mu equal to 20, they disappear immediately. Same, I could have, dropped this figure because it's similar to the other one. This figure shows an analysis in the parameter space. So let me dwell a little bit on this because the point is that in this, let's say, I'm showing G, N, and lowercase I, the prevalence, as function of two parameters, C and mu, so that for each combination of parameters, there is 1 point, okay, on this surface. 1 point here and 1 point here. Taking the triple, this point, this value, and this value, you have an equilibrium point of the system. So the surfaces represent the equilibrium values of each population according to the changes that you have in the parameter space, C mu, okay? And you see that the native squirrel population survives only in this region, otherwise it is 0. This is probably an artifact, okay? But it survives only here. So it means that C must be very small and mu must be in this range, which is kind of counter-expected because you see, for a very small mu here, the native species disappears. So if the disease does not kill very fast the individuals, like here, mu is small, then the total population collapses. But if the disease kills fast the individuals and C is small, then the total population thrives. And this is something that occurs also, I found it in an investigation also on bees, for example. The individual mortality, a strong individual mortality helps the survival of the whole colony. Why? If you have a disease that kills very slowly the individuals, then the population is doomed because the infected individuals remain more at length in the population, they spread the disease more. That is essentially the basic idea. Okay, this is a different situation with R and mu, similar considerations. I skip because I don't have time. And And here there is an instance of the oscillations that you can see. I said that there was a hope bifurcation. These two values seem to be close to zero, but they are not. So this is an oscillation of the three populations, in which you see only essentially the prevalence that oscillates very sharply. Okay, so the point is that we have only two equilibria that are desirable. The gray squirrels are wiped out and there is no disease, or the gray squirrels are wiped out with a disease remaining in the red. The gray squirrels are wiped out and the disease remains in the red ones. But all the other equilibria imply the persistence of the gray squirrel population, and in some cases the red squirrels can be wiped out, which is even worse. The red squirrel could outcompete the alien species, but they should have more weight in the interspecific competition. If you see question marks, it's because I deleted some other figures or formula, because otherwise I would have taken 3 hours. And okay, decreasing the growth rate of the gray squirrel and the carrying capacity, and increase the red squirrel mortality helps in the elimination of the invader. For example, this is one type of conclusion that you can obtain. In practice, there are two strategies to eradicate the invader: removal of gray squirrels followed by killing them, which is the actual strategy in the UK right now, I think. It is consistent with the regulations of the European community. The reduction of the reproductive rate means surgical sterilization, which implies also the subsequent release of the captured individuals. And so it's not it cannot be expected to give prompt effects, but it's an alternative. And so there could be possible ways of preserving the native red squirrel populations under specific parameter conditions, but the gray squirrel population must be kept in check. And also, if the disease is present, the interspecific transmission rate should be reduced or kept in check as well. So that's all for only the squirrels. The next step was to investigate the role of the predators, and the main predator for, so this is the paper, the main predator is a pine marten, which is a generalist predator, does not hunt only squirrels, but whatever it can find in its own territory. But it seems to have to be more effective on gray squirrels because they are bigger. Essentially, the idea is that gray squirrels are bigger, and so if they try to escape from the marten on the branches of the trees, their weight is too big, and so they come down, or the branches don't support them, and so they can be captured by the martens. The gray squirrels, for the gray squirrels, this is not the case, and so they can find a harbor in the on the smaller branches of the trees. The model setup now contains 4 populations. Again, G are asymptomatic virus carriers. Because we have 4 populations, we have decided to use simple mass action contact rates, because otherwise it would have been essentially untractable, the model, because we have the gray squirrels, which are virus carriers and asymptomatic, red squirrels, healthy, the infected ones, and then the predator, the pine marten. The pine marten obeys the logistic growth because it has other resources, but also hunts the 3 types of squirrels. And then there are some assumptions maybe on the way in which the hunting occurs, so on the parameters that involve hunting. The possible equilibria are listed here. Again, the question marks relate to formulas that are too complicated and I didn't show them in the slides, but there are only 4 possible outcomes because even this equilibrium, which does not contain the pine marten, which was, this is another general feature. This equilibrium is the coexistence equilibrium in the previous model, okay, in the model with 3 components only, only the 2 types of squirrels and the infected ones. Now, it was conditionally stable in the previous model, but now because you have the pine marten, it becomes unstable because the Jacobian has, I mean, the mathematical reason is because the Jacobian has 1 extra row and column, and then the eigenvalue relative to the pine marten plays a role in the stability of the whole equilibrium. And even if you satisfy the conditions as in the former model, this new eigenvalue may destabilize, in general does destabilize the equilibrium itself. I found this feature occurring in several models, not just in this one, in several investigations. And then there is also coexistence of the 4 populations, which is allowed, but because we found it numerically, because it's too complicated to study. There are transcritical bifurcations, for example, between E1 and E6. And okay, to avoid the undesired features, we should ensure that E1 and E3 do not arise and strive to satisfy the conditions for E6 and E7. And for example, these are the conditions that need to be satisfied. Again, I don't have the time to interpret them biologically, but they have a biological meaning, or at least they can be discussed in biological terms. To better investigate the situation, I introduced new parameters that are the killing rates of gray squirrels, relative killing rates of gray squirrels and red squirrels, and the relative interspecific competition, CM and CR, for the pine marten and the red squirrels. And these are essentially the reciprocals of their carrying capacities, okay? CM is H over G. If you go back to the model, H over G is the reciprocal of the carrying capacity. G over H is the carrying capacity, okay? Okay, then you can state the, I mean, some of these feasibility and stability conditions in terms of these quantities. For example, this condition implies stability, or I mean, renders E1 stable, essentially, equilibrium E1 stable. And then you can find other ones. The point is that, okay, you investigate theoretically these features, but then with the realistic parameter values, they are hardly satisfied. So the problem is that you are back to the situation that it is difficult to check what is the actual outcome of the system, especially if you want no gray squirrels around. For example, you can make the gray squirrel go extinct, but then you need U small and H less than 2. Predator persistence is achieved for small to H to moderate H values independently from U, and similar features. There is also another condition that involves transmission, the disease transmission parameters and disease mortality, and which is this one, and which ensures that, I mean, the gray squirrel free point could be achieved. Here is another picture with a sensitivity picture, let's say, in which you have the gray squirrels that survive in this range, the red squirrels that survive in the opposite range. Essentially, this is a separatrix of the two points of attraction, but the disease is persistent in this case, and the pine marten is essentially unaffected except by the parameter h. So the lower h is, this is the origin, the higher the pine marten density. As I said, so you can try to achieve the gray squirrel extinction by using or let's say by, if U is large enough and if H, for example, is small enough, or if H and U fall on the right of this separatrix line. But in this case, you cannot eradicate the disease. I have other figures that I deleted in which maybe you can show also the other equilibrium of the system in which also the disease disappears, but I cut them out. And then there are other conditions. For example, the virus free point needs this condition. The most desirable outcome, for the most desirable outcome, H is a critical parameter. Okay. I skip this. Okay, here there is another situation in which you have the red squirrel that survives with the disease and with the pine marten. This is a rather small stripe, and everywhere else here the gray squirrel, the red squirrel, the native squirrel is wiped out. This is in the parameter range HR, where R is a reproduction rate of the gray squirrel. Before we had H and U was one of the carrying capacities, I believe, of the gray squirrel. U is, well, we have to go back because I don't remember, but so here, R is related to the carrying, the interspecific competition of the gray squirrel. H is the interspecific competition of the marten, and I forgot what was the other parameter. Maybe, well, doesn't matter. You can interpret these things. U is the hunting of the marten over the gray squirrel. But as I said, I have several such pictures with several combinations of these parameters. And again, a large disease mortality helps the gray squirrel population to grow, and similar considerations can be done for other parameters, and now I skip them. But another situation for mu and R pairing, and again, there is one range in the parameter space where the native species is extinct, and when the invader survives, here essentially the gray squirrel disappears, but the disease is endemic among the native species. Okay, the native species may benefit from the presence of the pine marten, and essentially because the pine marten drives the system toward points or features, let's say configurations where the native squirrel is favored, and but the disease is likely to remain endemic. So the presence of the predator alone cannot guarantee the eradication of the invader. For example, culling a portion of the invader could not be a suitable way out, and probably it is better to try to alter the parameter values to make, I mean, to force them to belong to the subsets of the parameter space that ensure the desired outcome. Okay. So this is essentially.
Ezio, I just wanted to say you have around 10 minutes left.
Yeah. Okay. I'll try to go fast. So for hares, it's a situation, except there is a European hare that invades, this is the part of Piemonte, this is Torino. The European hare, which is not the native one, is here in the plains. On the mountains, in the gray points, gray areas, there is a native Italian species, which is a northern, the mountain hare, and shaded area represents a hybrid species that has begun to arise when the two mated together about 150 years ago. And the point is that these two species are very territorial, and so they have contacts only along the boundaries. And this idea forced me to use a model that is based on herd behavior, or essentially square root response function, which is different from other ideas that were proposed recently or less recently by other researchers. And so the idea is that I'm assuming that whenever the interaction occurs on the boundary is related to the square root of to the square root of the population density in the territory, because the boundary of an area is a one-dimensional manifold and the area is a two-dimensional manifold. So the point is that if you have an interaction between a mountain and the European hare together along the boundary, they must interact only via the one-dimensional manifold. The hybrid species, which is living in the shaded area, which is essentially a line, is already a one-dimensional manifold. So the whole population contributes to the interaction. And while the other species interacts only on the boundary. And then the the hybrid species can reproduce by contacts with the European, with the mountain hare. So you have plus reproduction terms here. You have interspecific competition also. And I don't know if you see here, but there is also a direct a reproduction term that comes from direct interactions between mountain and European hares, where there is no hybrid in between. But this remark prompts another observation. The point is that when the hybrid species, the two invader and native mate on the boundary, then the hybrid is born. And then the hybrid starts to reproduce, and so the two boundaries between the two native and invader species separate. So a better model than this one assumes that these coefficients that are with tilde change in time, not really explicit in time, but change with the size of the hybrid population. The higher the hybrid population becomes, the smaller the possibility of the dark area and the light area to touch each other become. And so another formulation of the model assumes this, replaces the coefficients with functions of h, and the model becomes essentially, I don't know. Anyway, the coefficients would become functions of h, or you can simply remove these coefficients and have a simplified model. Okay, in these cases, one referee wanted us to eliminate the singularity that arises if you differentiate the square root term when e is 0. So he suggested to use a new variable. So in terms of p and u, the model gets reformulated in this way. And then, there are two equilibria, system disappearance and whole system coexistence that can arise, but only, the latter can be assessed by simulations. And then there are also particular cases like these that need to be investigated apart. Sorry. I think I was here. But some of them are unstable, and essentially only one is subject to, can arise if under this condition. There are simulations that show that the hybrid species can go to zero, but other ones in which there is coexistence. And these are the parameters that we have used. There are only some changes in among two situations, for example, in this parameter, and then maybe in another one here, in these here. I mean, these changes are related to the figures that I showed you before. But here you see that this is a bifurcation diagram in terms of QE. So the native species U disappears for the value 1.3 with these coefficients. You have coexistence, and then you have the hybrid and invaders only. If you alter this value, oh, sorry, anyway, maybe it's later. These are, I mean, these are particular equilibria of the original system that can be, need to be analyzed immediately because, I mean, on the original system, not in the PU space, because they contain, I mean, the reformatted model would contain a division by zero. So you need to do the analysis on the original system. And this shows that, for example, you have feasibility conditions, but you have also some necessary conditions for the stability of these points. Here is what I wanted to say. The point is that we have investigated possible climatic changes, showing that, I mean, assuming that raising the temperature changes some values of the coefficients. And so the point is that if you have, this is a figure that we had before, in which the mountain and the invader, no, this is different. The mountain and the invaders are at the beginning. So they both thrive with no hybrid. But if you change the values of the temperature, let's say with a 20% change in the climatic factors, the coefficient change, and then you have different situations because here you see the levels are 160 and 80, and here they are above, and this is more or less the same, but it's actually lower. And for the transcritical bifurcation, the point is that we had this vanishing of the native species at 1.3 in the previous slide that I was talking some time ago about, and here it vanishes earlier. And if you still increase the temperature, then the native species disappears almost immediately at 115, let's say. In this case, you have the coexistence equilibrium and hybrid equilibrium and hybrid and native species that disappear, excuse me, that settle at 40. But then if you change the temperature, then the native species gets extinguished. So the main point here, I just skipped these things, but the point is that, excuse me, it is very slow. Okay. You can have also a sensitivity figure as before in terms of the parameters, but the main point of this talk is essentially that the release of European hares in for hunting purposes, deliberate release of European hares for hunting purposes in the Alps should be avoided. This because what people do here is they buy these European hares, for example, in the eastern countries, they transfer them to Italy, they release them in the mountains in order to hunt them. But this favors the invasion because, as we said, the hybrid species would grow, and this will in turn reduce the number of the native species. I still have to talk about the hare behavior, but you should tell me if you allow me or not, because now it's 4 and I don't know. I haven't only maybe, let me ask you, let me wait for your answer, Ivo.
I don't know. I think maybe if there are some questions, it would be a good idea to ask the questions.
While people maybe think, I just point out one thing. So in this model, I skipped this, but the point is that I'm using square roots, okay, as I said before, because this is a more theoretical part of the previous investigation.
Mm-hmm.
If we set up, apart from some features that I skipped, if we set up a competition model in this situation, so with both species that compete on the boundary, so you see 2 square roots in both terms, this is a competition model. The feature of this model is that it exhibits tri-stability. You have only the origin, so trajectories go to the axis and then go to 0. Go to the axis and go to 0. You have bistability, one equilibrium here and one equilibrium here. So this is competition, classical competition, 2 saddles here and here. But you have a feature in which you have also 2 other saddles here and here. One exclusion, and then coexistence in between. This situation here. And this is a new feature because it's not due to for the 2-dimensional model, you can also have limit cycles, but they are not due to the Holling type 2 dynamics, but to these type of interactions. And for competition models, you get tri-stability, which is essentially forbidden for standard classical competition models. There is a theorem that says that. And in this last case, the competition, although you have this phenomenon, the 2 species, so this is the initial condition. If you have the classical model, the system goes down here. With the competition on the boundary, you go here. So both species are favored if the competition occurs only through the boundary, because the individuals that are inside the herd are not affected by the competition itself. Okay, so that was a major point that I wanted to say. There is a paper on JTB on that, and I stop here then and wait for questions if there are.
I mean, if anyone wants to ask a question, this can be done by either just showing yourself and asking by unmuting, or you can type questions in the chat. I maybe have one question around the bigger picture of the squirrel models. So when you look at the squirrel models and you look at the different influences on the squirrel population. So you have on the one hand, the gray squirrel that is outcompeting the red squirrel. So I think that is in a way the basic situation. Yeah. Then on top of that, you have the infection that favors the gray squirrel because it affects the red squirrel more. And on top of that, you have the pine marten that seems to be more dangerous for the gray squirrel because it is selective and eats the gray squirrel a bit more than the red squirrel. So when you look at this really complicated situation and look at all the models you have considered, what do you think would be the most promising approaches to help the red squirrel, basically? So would it be to directly change the competition between the red and the gray squirrel? So that means something like removing gray squirrels or introducing red squirrels. And the other possibility would be to look at the disease. And the third possibility would be to maybe increase the population of the pine martens. So is there some insight you can
Yeah.
get from your models what the best strategy of these three would be?
I don't have an answer on the spot, but I didn't think of increasing the pine marten numbers at all. Also because I was concerned mainly to the, let's say, mathematical part of the model. The biological details to Valentina, essentially. But what she says essentially is that it is hard to act on the system parameters. So, for example, reducing the contact rate of the disease is, questionable in the sense that nobody knows how to do it in practice. What I mentioned is that culling of the gray squirrels or trying to diminish their reproduction rate, artificial sterilization, are the strategies that are used nowadays. And other than that, yeah, the point is that raising the number of pine martens, I'm not sure, because as I said, they are not really specialists. So it may, since they feed on other populations, it may turn out that you might have other outcomes that are not really so desirable. I don't know. One should investigate that. The basic lesson that we have learned is that it is really a difficult problem in practice. So the models help in understanding something, but don't give you a viable solution. The viable solution must be found by some means that ecologists have to find. Okay? So I would say this is probably the bottom line, unfortunately.
Okay.
Not always the case. I have another, I don't think of talk about that, but I have another model on a disease among goats in which the model tells you really the solution of the situation. So maybe,
okay.
I don't know, if you have a spring version of the thing, maybe I can talk about that, but I don't know. That was only one.
I don't expect that for something as complicated as the squirrel invasion, there is something that you can really easily give us a solution, because I think several countries are struggling with that. We have a question from the audience, Ezio. There is one question from Jeffrey Parker, and he says, thank you very much. I gather for the squirrel models that H, the parameter H, is both critical and highly uncertain. I wonder if you might discuss what basis is available for these parameters, I assume, and or if there's a way to get a good estimate for this parameter.
Okay, the answer to the first part is that I don't have any data.
Okay.
Or maybe I should say better. Maybe you should look into the paper. I'm not sure about which of the four models he's talking about now, but maybe the last one. So maybe let me try to find it. H is the intraspecific competition. If this is the parameter that he talks about, it's the intraspecific competition of the pine marten. But okay, it may be possible that the question comes from one of these pictures that I've shown. And as I said, this is only a very small subset of similar sensitivity pictures. So it is possible that not only H, but some other parameters have similar features. So what was the second part of the question? I don't have any basis for, for these values. And if there are, maybe I suggest to look. There is a DOI here to look into this paper, because if there is more information, Valentina has put it in the paper. On the spot, I do not recall. What was the second part of the question? You cannot see the.
I think he might be interested in, if there's a way you can think of that this parameter might be measured a bit better. But I think it's probably similar with many species where there may or may not be a good way to measure intraspecific competition. So I think that in general, it's not always easy to.
Competition is very difficult. I guess, I mean, interspecific competition is related to carrying capacities. So if you have an idea of what G is, which probably biologists can measure, I mean, reproduction rate, and then you can have a rough idea of how many martens are in a certain territory, then you can find out age, perhaps. I mean, but I don't know with, I mean, if it is a reliable way of doing it, but I would suggest that that would be a possibility. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but
yeah, I think I would assume if I understood the question correctly, that that might be a good answer.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Ah, yeah. Thanks, Jeffrey.
You can talk, it's better because and showing stuff maybe.
Sorry, I got to find a quiet space every once in a while. But thank you very much for the talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So I don't see any further questions. So maybe what I'll do is I will again share my screen and show you, if I can find it myself, the upcoming talks, because we will have a break next week. So next week we won't have a seminar, but then in 2 weeks we will have a presentation by Professor Paul Bresloff from Utah. And Paul Bresloff is a scientist who is interested, among other things, in stochastic cell biology. So this seminar will be a bit later than usual. It will be at 5 p.m. Because otherwise it would be really early for Paul. So I will send out invitations to everyone who is already on the list. If anyone else wants to get on the list, then please drop any of the organizers an email and we will send out invitations to you as well. Well, I would like to thank Ezio for giving this talk, and I would like to thank all the participants of the seminar for joining. And well, I hope to see quite a few of you again in 2 weeks. Thanks a lot.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.